My family held my funeral. I attended as a creditor. The polished oak of the casket gleamed under the chapel lights, a beautiful container for a man who was, at that moment, sitting 10 rows back calculating the exact cost of his family's fabricated grief. They had declared me dead to inherit my life's work. Little did they know, their greatest creditor was about to attend the reading of the will. For an instant, Arthur Vance was a man without weight. The familiar pressure of the safety harness against his chest vanished, replaced by a stomach-lurching emptiness as the world tilted on an impossible axis. Below him, the grid of rebar and concrete, the skeletal floor of the 40th story, rushed up with an indifferent finality. There was no time for a life flashing before his eyes, only the percussive snap of the failed tether, the whistle of air past his ears, and the distant, tinny shouts of his men, sounds that belonged to a world he had just departed. His impact with the safety netting 3 floors down was not a soft catch but a brutal, bone-shattering collision. The woven mesh, designed to cradle, instead acted as a violent snare. He felt a white-hot explosion in his skull as his head whipped back, and then the world dissolved into a silent, featureless black. The silence of the scaffold gave way to the metronomic sigh of a ventilator. Arthur existed in a fog, a place without thought or form, while the world outside his body moved on. The first to arrive at the sterile, white-walled ICU was his brother. Edward Vance was a man tailored in quiet grays and blues, his face a carefully constructed mask of solemn concern. He stood by the bed, his gaze not on Arthur's still form, but on the rhythmic dance of the monitors, as if reading a stock ticker. He didn't touch his brother's hand, he merely checked his watch. He made the necessary calls. First to Liam, then to Chloe. Liam arrived reeking of expensive cologne and impatience, his tailored suit looking out of place amidst the antiseptic efficiency of the hospital. He paced the small waiting area, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. "Have they said anything definitive?" he asked Edward, his voice a low growl of frustration. "I have a merger call with the Tokyo office in 4 hours. This is inconvenient." Chloe drifted in 20 minutes later, a vision in cashmere and curated sorrow. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her makeup was flawless. She clutched a handkerchief to her mouth, her distress a theatrical performance for the nurses. "Oh, Daddy," she whispered, her voice catching as she approached the bed, stopping just short of making physical contact. She looked at Edward, her expression shifting from grief to anxious query. "What does this mean?" "For everything. It means we wait," Edward said, his tone flat and managerial. He had already spoken to the head of neurosurgery. The prognosis was delivered in a stream of clinical terms: severe traumatic brain injury, diffuse axonal shearing, Glasgow coma scale of 3. But Edward had distilled it all down to a single, operative phrase: profoundly unlikely recovery. Later, when the floor was quiet and the visiting hours had officially ended, the 3 of them stood a silent vigil around the bed that held their father, their brother, their source. The rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor was the only sound for a long time. "He wouldn't want the company to stall," Liam said finally, breaking the quiet. He looked at Edward, a silent challenge passing between them. "Vance Construction is his life's work. It needs decisive leadership. A power vacuum right now could be catastrophic." "Liam's right," Chloe added, her voice regaining its composure. She dabbed at a non-existent tear. "Think of the shareholders. Think of the legacy. We have to protect it." Edward remained still, his gaze fixed on Arthur's face. The mask of concern had slipped, replaced by the cool, impassive look of a chess player assessing the board. He had spent decades in his older brother's shadow, the meticulous accountant to Arthur's visionary builder. He had managed the empire, but Arthur had owned it. "The doctor was clear," Edward stated, his voice barely above a whisper, as if sharing a corporate secret. "Even if he wakes up, the man we knew, the man who ran the company, is gone. For all intents and purposes, he has already left us." He let the words hang in the air, heavy with implication. He wasn't speaking of a man's life, but of a legal and financial status. A new kind of silence descended upon the room, thicker and colder than the one that had followed the accident. It was a silence of consensus, of predatory anticipation. They looked from one to another, a dark understanding passing between them. They were no longer the family of a man fighting for his life. They were the heirs to an estate, standing over a problem that was quietly solving itself. The hum of the hospital faded, replaced by the hushed, expensive quiet of a law firm. 2 weeks after Arthur's fall, Edward, Liam, and Chloe sat across a mahogany desk so vast it seemed like a monument to billable hours. Between them and the family's long-standing lawyer, a man named Marcus Thorne, lay a stack of documents bound in crisp, blue covers. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and the unspoken weight of what they were there to do. The medical consensus is unequivocal, Edward began, his voice a calm, reasonable drone that belied the rapaciousness of his intent. He slid a folder across the polished wood. 3 independent neurologists concur. My brother's cognitive function is, for all practical purposes, gone. To leave him in this state, legally speaking, is to leave his entire legacy vulnerable. Liam nodded, leaning forward with an air of manufactured gravity. We can't let the company drift, Marcus. Dad built Vance Construction from nothing. It requires a firm hand. The markets are already jittery. Chloe, playing her part, dabbed her eye with a silk handkerchief. And the medical care, it's astronomical. We need to be able to access his accounts to ensure he gets the absolute best, no matter the cost. It was a perfectly rehearsed performance. The concerned brother, the responsible son, the devoted daughter. Marcus Thorne, a man whose career was built on navigating the unpleasant necessities of the wealthy, scanned the medical affidavits. The legal path was clear: a petition for conservatorship based on medical incapacitation. With no spouse and with his children and brother in unanimous agreement, the court would likely expedite the process. It was a clean, bloodless procedure. The judge's signature was a mere formality. Within a week, Edward was granted full legal authority over Arthur Vance's personal and professional affairs. The man in the hospital bed, kept alive by tubes and machines, was now a legal non-entity, his will supplanted by his brother's. The liquidation began with a chilling efficiency. It started small, almost plausibly. We need to cover the Swiss clinic's consultation fee, Edward would announce, and a portfolio of municipal bonds would be sold. The first true sign of the rot, however, was the sale of Arthur's classic 1958 Aston Martin DB4. It was his one true indulgence, a machine he had lovingly restored with his own hands. An unnecessary asset, Liam declared during one of their strategy meetings, held in Arthur's now vacant office. It's just sitting in a garage depreciating. The money from that sale can be funneled into a high-yield investment vehicle. He said it without a hint of sentiment, as if discussing a piece of surplus machinery. Chloe agreed. Besides, the insurance premiums are absurd. That money could pay for a year of round-the-clock nursing. The check from the private sale, however, was quietly rerouted. A portion went to a newly established medical trust, a legal necessity for appearances, while the lion's share was used to pay off the ballooning credit card debt from Chloe's last European shopping tour. Their actions revealed a lifetime of simmering resentment. Father always treated the company coffers like his personal piggy bank, Liam complained to Edward one evening, after they had successfully pushed through a plan to leverage 3 of Arthur's debt-free properties for a speculative commercial development, a move Arthur had always forbidden as reckless. He never trusted my instincts. Now, we can finally modernize. The conspiracy wasn't a recent invention, it was the final, terrible flowering of seeds planted long ago. They had been waiting in the wings, not for Arthur to retire, but for him to be removed. Edward had the financial infrastructure ready, a series of shell corporations and offshore accounts he had meticulously constructed over years, waiting for an opportunity to divert the flow of wealth. Liam had his list of visionary projects Arthur had vetoed. Chloe had her endless list of wants. The sale of Arthur's lakeside cabin in upstate New York was the final desecration. It was a rustic, unpretentious place, the only property not held under the corporate umbrella. It was where Arthur had taught them to skip stones and identify constellations. Edward framed its sale as a sorrowful necessity. The upkeep is a drain, and the property taxes are substantial, he explained to the company's board. Its value is better utilized ensuring the stability of our core assets. The funds were officially earmarked for a new, experimental long-term care facility. In reality, they became the down payment for a penthouse apartment for Liam and a new equestrian stable for Chloe. The Vance family was not just seizing an inheritance, they were methodically erasing the man who had built it, selling off his life piece by piece under the guise of saving him. The first thing to pierce the long darkness was a sliver of warmth across his face. It was followed by a scent, not the sterile tang of antiseptic, but the clean, resinous perfume of pine trees carried on a cool breeze. Arthur's eyelids fluttered, heavy as stone shutters. He was not in the ICU. The rhythmic sigh of the ventilator was gone, replaced by the distant chirping of birds. He was in a simple room, painted a calming shade of pale blue. A window looked out onto a dense forest, sunlight filtering through the canopy. A woman sat in a chair by his bed, her focus on a tablet in her lap. She had a kind, tired face and wore simple nurse's scrubs. When she saw his eyes were open, she offered a small, reassuring smile. "Welcome back, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice soft. "My name is Maria. Do you know where you are?" Arthur tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged. His throat felt like sandpaper. He shook his head, a minuscule movement that felt like a monumental effort. "You're at the Northwood Recovery Clinic." "It's very private," she explained, helping him sip some water from a straw. The cool liquid was a revelation. "Your family does not know you are here. As far as they are concerned, you were transferred to a state-run long-term hospice facility 2 months ago. They believe you are unresponsive." The words hung in the air. 2 months. He stared at her, confusion warring with a rising dread. Maria seemed to understand the torrent of questions trapped behind his eyes. "I was one of your nurses at the city hospital," she continued, her expression turning serious. "I overheard them. Your brother, your children. They weren't planning your recovery, they were planning their inheritance." The clinical coldness of her statement struck Arthur harder than the fall. He had seen the greed in them for years, had written it off as the callow ambition of the young and the quiet resentment of a man who lived in a shadow. But this was a different thing entirely. "I couldn't let it happen," Maria said, her gaze steady and unwavering. "When your brother, Edward, signed the transfer papers for the hospice, a place people go to be forgotten, I made a different arrangement. I used a discretionary fund for anonymous benefactors to move you here under the name John Smith. Officially, Arthur Vance has vanished from the medical system." Over the next few days, as strength slowly seeped back into his atrophied limbs, Maria became his window to the world he had left behind. She brought him a laptop, and with trembling hands, he began to read. She had curated a file for him, a chronology of his own erasure. The first document was a press release from Vance Construction. It announced Liam Vance as the new acting CEO, praising his bold, aggressive vision for the company's future. It was accompanied by a photo of Liam in Arthur's office, leaning against his desk with an unearned confidence. A quote from Edward praised Liam's courage in stepping up during this family tragedy. The next was a clipping from a society magazine. It showed Chloe at a charity gala, draped in diamonds. The caption mentioned her brave public appearance while her father remained in palliative care. But it was the financial reports that truly twisted the knife. Maria had managed to get printouts from a contact inside his private wealth management firm. Portfolio statements showed massive liquidations. Stocks, bonds, mutual funds, all sold. The justification in the transaction notes was always the same: to cover extensive medical and long-term care expenses. Then he saw it. A real estate listing for his lakeside cabin. The photos showed the familiar stone fireplace, the worn leather armchair where Head spent countless evenings, the dock from which Head taught his children to fish. A red banner was slashed across the top of the page sold. Arthur leaned back against the pillows, the screen blurring before his eyes. It wasn't rage he felt. It was a profound, hollowing cold. The betrayal was so complete, so ruthlessly efficient, it was almost a work of art. They had not simply stolen from him. They had unmade him, auctioning off his life, his work, his memories, piece by piece, all while he lay helpless in a bed. He looked down at his hands, the skin thin and pale but the knuckles still thick, the hands of a man who built things. A flicker of something hard and unyielding began to glow in the pit of his stomach. They thought they had buried him. They had only planted a seed. The first phone call was a masterpiece of calculated risk. Maria, using a prepaid burner phone from a town 60 miles away, dialed a private number that had never passed through a corporate switchboard. When a calm, measured voice answered, she spoke the exact words Arthur had dictated, his voice still a rough whisper. "Mr. Chen, this is regarding the original blueprints for the Northwood project. We've found a critical flaw in the Foundation's load-bearing calculations." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I don't recall a Northwood project," the voice said, cautious and sharp. "Arthur Vance does," Maria replied, and hung up. 3 days later, a nondescript sedan rolled up the long, pine-lined driveway of the clinic. Samuel Chin emerged, a man whose slight frame and impeccably tailored suit seemed at odds with the rustic setting. He carried a worn leather briefcase and an expression of profound disbelief. Maria led him to room 4B, where he stopped dead in the doorway. The man in the bed was a ghost of Arthur Vance. Thinner, paler, but the same steel-gray eyes, now burning with a cold, focused light, met his. "Samuel," Arthur rasped. "I'm glad you came." For an hour, Arthur laid it all out. The accident, the hospital whispers Maria had overheard, the methodical plundering of his life's work documented in the clippings and printouts spread across his bed. Samuel listened without interruption, his face a mask of professional neutrality that slowly hardened into something resembling cold fury. He was a lawyer who had built his reputation on the sanctity of contracts and wills. What he was hearing was the ultimate breach. "They had you declared legally incapacitated," Samuel said, his voice tight. "To reverse that, we'd have to go to court. You'd be subjected to a battery of medical and psychiatric evaluations. They would fight, claim you're not competent, that you're being manipulated. It would be a public circus, and they'd use your own money to bury you in legal fees." "I have no intention of going to court as Arthur Vance," Arthur replied, a strange calm settling over him. "Arthur Vance is a helpless invalid in a hospice bed. He has a memory they are picking clean. He has finished. I need to be someone else." Samuel nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "A new identity is not a simple matter." "I'm not asking for simple," Arthur said. "I'm asking for possible." He then spoke of something even his brother, the meticulous CFO, did not know. 20 years prior, after a particularly hostile takeover attempt, Arthur had established a series of blind trusts and holding companies through a discreet firm in Zurich. It was his ultimate contingency plan, a financial fortress built in secret, seeded with enough capital to be self-sustaining. The access protocols were tied to biometric data and a series of verbal passphrases known only to him. "This money," Arthur explained, his voice gaining strength, "is not on any Vance construction ledger. It is beyond Edward's reach. It is the foundation for what comes next." The clinic room became their first command center. With Samuel's legal guidance and Maria's logistical support, the ghost of Arthur Vance began to disappear, and a new man started to take shape on paper. Passports, driver's licenses, and bank accounts were forged not through criminality, but through the labyrinthine but legitimate channels of international business law. A man named Alastair Graves was born, a man with no history but a pristine credit record and significant capital, courtesy of a wire transfer from a Swiss trust. Weeks later, Alastair Graves, now walking with a cane but with the same determined gait as Arthur Vance, moved into a minimalist apartment in a city 3 states away. The apartment was his residence. A small, anonymous office suite in a nearby tower was his headquarters. It contained only a desk, a chair, and a bank of monitors connected to a military-grade encrypted network set up by a security consultant Samuel had on retainer. From this sterile command center, Arthur, now Alastair, accessed his financial arsenal for the first time in months. The numbers on the screen represented a power his family thought they had completely usurped. He felt no thrill of victory, only the grim satisfaction of a master builder picking up his tools. He began to move the money, not in a torrent, but in a carefully controlled flow. He wasn't spending it, he was transforming it. He established new holding companies with anodyne names like Trident Equity Partners and Apex Consolidated Ventures. He was building a web, a financial structure designed for one purpose: to become the sole creditor for every dollar of reckless debt his son and brother were undoubtedly racking up. He was transforming his old wealth from a target into a weapon, a precision instrument of financial justice. From his quiet command center, Arthur watched his legacy burn. The glow from his monitors cast long shadows across the room as he tracked the slow-motion demolition of Vance Construction. Freed from his father's cautious, debt-averse principles, Liam was a force of pure, unadulterated hubris. He initiated 3 massive, high-risk development projects simultaneously, including a glass and steel luxury condominium tower on a floodplain Arthur had spent a decade fighting to have rezoned as a nature preserve. The project was flashy, architecturally indulgent, and financially insane. Liam funded his new vision by leveraging the company's solid, debt-free assets to the hilt. Banks, eager for the business of a legacy firm, practically threw money at him. Corporate credit lines were extended, high-interest bridge loans were secured, and bonds were issued with promises of spectacular returns. Liam saw it as bold leadership. Arthur saw it as a child setting fire to his inheritance for warmth. Chloe, for her part, had established a philanthropic arm of the company, the Vance Family Foundation for the Arts. In reality, it was a slush fund for her lifestyle, sponsoring lavish galas that served as networking events for her socialite friends and underwriting vanity projects for aspiring artists who happened to catch her eye. The foundation's operating costs were staggering: a black hole of chartered jets, 5-star hotel suites, and couture gowns, all logged as legitimate corporate expenses. Edward presided over this chaos with a veneer of fiscal prudence that was, in itself, a profound form of fraud. He was no fool. He saw the catastrophic burn rate. But instead of reining in his niece and nephew, he facilitated their excess. He expertly shuffled money between departments, cooked the quarterly reports to paint a picture of aggressive growth rather than impending insolvency, and placated the increasingly nervous board with complex financial projections that were pure fiction. His true genius lay in ensuring that, as the ship took on water, his personal lifeboat was already being filled with gold. He approved massive executive performance bonuses for the 3 of them, funneling millions out of the company and into their private accounts just as fast as Liam could borrow it. They were a perfect, self-destructing ecosystem of greed. Liam's recklessness created the debt, Chloe's profligacy drained the cash reserves, and Edward's quiet corruption hid the truth from the world. And for every new loan they took, for every new line of credit they opened, a quiet inquiry would be made a few weeks later. A representative from a discreet private equity firm, Trident Equity Partners, would contact the lending institution. The offers were always the same: we will buy that debt from you. Not at a discount, but at full value, plus a small premium for the trouble. To the banks, it was a godsend. They got to offload the increasingly risky Vance debt from their books for a profit, no questions asked. The paperwork was always impeccable, the wire transfers instantaneous. They didn't know or care that Trident Equity was merely a shell, a legal entity with a mailing address in Delaware and a bank account in the Caymans. They didn't know that every signature on those purchase agreements belonged to a man named Alastair Graves, who was methodically, patiently, gathering the leashes that now bound his former company. Arthur worked with the cold precision of a demolition expert setting charges. He tracked every expenditure, every foolish acquisition, every wire transfer. He watched them auction off his company's fleet of heavy machinery he had bought and maintained himself, only to lease it all back at an exorbitant rate. He saw them sell the company's headquarters, the very building he had designed, in a sale-leaseback deal that traded long-term stability for a short-term cash infusion. With each transaction, he made his move. The loan for the floodplain tower, the line of credit for the Ark Foundation, the corporate bonds issued to cover operating shortfalls, one by one, they were all acquired by his network of ghost companies. He was not just an observer to their incompetence, he was its silent beneficiary. He owned their failure. The vultures were feasting, unaware that the carcass they were devouring was tied to a golden chain, and the man holding that chain was sitting in a dark room, waiting for the moment to pull it tight. The announcement came 6 months after Arthur's fall. It was released on the Vance Construction corporate letterhead, a tasteful, somber statement penned by Edward. It spoke of a brave but ultimately peaceful decline and the family's profound sorrow. The statement announced that Arthur Vance, after months in a non-responsive state following his tragic accident, had passed away quietly. It was a lie so complete, so official, that for a moment, sitting in his stark office, Arthur felt a strange, dissociative chill, as if he were reading his own authentic obituary. The lie was a strategic necessity for them. A man legally incapacitated was a legal gray area, a lingering complication. A man declared dead, with a signed death certificate obtained through a network of corruptible officials Edward had cultivated for years, was a clean slate. It triggered the final clauses in the company bylaws, dissolved any lingering questions of power of attorney, and, most importantly, allowed for the execution of his will, a will they believed left everything to them. It was the final step in their hostile takeover. What followed was a masterclass in performative grief. The funeral was to be a major public event, a testament not to Arthur's life, but to their supposed devotion. Arthur watched it all unfold through a firewalled laptop, an unseen ghost at his own wake. He saw the event planner's website, password protected but easily breached by Samuel's tech consultant. The project title was the Vance Memorial Service. The details were nauseatingly lavish. A string quartet was hired to play Handel's Saraband, a piece of music Arthur had always despised. The flower arrangements alone cost more than his first home, a cascade of white lilies and orchids that would fill the city's grandest cathedral. A catering contract detailed a post-service reception with champagne fountains in an open bar, a celebration masquerading as a commiseration. The entire affair was being funded, Arthur noted with grim irony, by a short-term business loan from a bank whose debt was now wholly owned by Apex Consolidated Ventures. He read the draft of a eulogy Edward had written for himself to deliver. It was a work of pure fiction, painting a portrait of a beloved patriarch, a gentle mentor, a man whose quiet wisdom had guided his adoring family. It spoke of their unbearable loss and their solemn vow to carry his legacy forward into a new era. Through a secured feed, Arthur even watched a video of Liam being fitted for a bespoke morning suit, complaining to the tailor that the cut wasn't sharp enough. He saw Chloe's emails with the memorial's organizers, debating the precise shade of black for the commemorative programs and insisting on a photo of Arthur from 20 years ago, when he was younger and more photogenic, to be printed on the cover. It was all a grotesque stage play, and they were the stars. The funeral wasn't key for him, it was for the public, for the shareholders, for the banks. It was a carefully orchestrated piece of theater designed to cement their image as the grieving, dutiful heirs, tragically burdened with a great responsibility. It was their coronation disguised as a funeral. From his silent observation post, Arthur felt a final, brittle piece of his old life break away. The part of him that might have held on to some sliver of hope, some possibility of misunderstanding, was gone. There was no pain left, no sentimental anger. There was only the cold, clear perspective of a man who had been pushed so far beyond the boundaries of family and love that he could see his own life, and its end, as a purely tactical problem. On the eve of the service, Samuel Chin visited the office. He laid a single, engraved invitation on the desk. It was identical to the ones being sent to the city's business elite. "It's time," Samuel said quietly. Arthur picked up the heavy cardstock. It felt alien in his hand. He looked not at his own name, but at the address of the cathedral and the time of the service. He wasn't planning to mourn. He was preparing to foreclose. The bells of St. Mark's Cathedral told a slow, somber rhythm against the gray, overcast sky. A procession of black luxury cars discharged the city's elite onto the cathedral steps, bankers, developers, politicians, all clad in dark, expensive wool, their faces composed in masks of public sympathy. They were here to pay their respects to Arthur Vance, a titan of industry, a man whose name was etched in steel and concrete across the city's skyline. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of lilies and beeswax. The string quartet played its mournful tune as ushers guided guests to their seats in the heavy oak pews. At the front, before the altar, sat an enormous, closed casket of polished mahogany, adorned with a single spray of white roses. Beside it, in the front row, sat the grieving family. Liam, his face a study in stoic sorrow. Chloe, veiled and dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. And Edward, the picture of quiet dignity, the dutiful brother holding the family together in their darkest hour. 20 minutes after the service was scheduled to begin, just as the last of the notable guests had been seated, a black town car, unlike the others, pulled up not to the main entrance but to a quiet side door. Two men stepped out. The first was Samuel Chen, his expression grim and unreadable. The second was a man no one would have recognized. He was impeccably dressed in a dark gray suit, tailored to perfection. His hair, once the color of steel, was now almost entirely white, cut shorter than he used to wear it. He wore a pair of simple, modern glasses that subtly altered the lines of his face. He walked with the aid of a simple but elegant black cane, a concession to the lingering weakness in his legs, but he moved with a purpose that was anything but frail. He was Alastair Graves, and he looked like what he was, a man who owned things. They entered the vast, echoing space of the cathedral not as mourners, but as attendees at a business meeting. An usher, noting their late arrival, moved to intercept them, but Samuel Chen simply flashed a small, discreet card. The usher's eyes widened slightly, and he immediately stepped aside, gesturing them toward the back. Arthur, Alastair, took a seat in the very last pew, a shadowy alcove near the main doors. From this vantage point, he could see everything. He saw the back of his son's head, the slight tremble in his daughter's shoulders, the rigid posture of his brother. He saw the faces of men he had done business with for 30 years, men who were now looking at his children with a mixture of pity and calculation. They were all there, assembled for the final act of a play he had no part in writing. He felt nothing. No surge of anger, no pang of loss. The man they were mourning in that casket was a stranger to him now. He was a character in a story they had invented. The reality was the man sitting in the back pew, holding a portfolio of secured debt that amounted to 97% of the Vance Empire's total liabilities. The service began. A priest spoke in platitudes about life and loss. A business partner delivered a brief, sanitized tribute, carefully avoiding any mention of the company's recent, erratic direction. Then Chloe, her voice thick with practiced emotion, read a poem about a mighty oak falling in the forest. It was a flawless performance. Arthur sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the silver head of his cane. He was an anonymous presence, a ghost in plain sight. A few people in the surrounding pews glanced at the latecomer, a passing flicker of curiosity at the unfamiliar, authoritative figure, before turning their attention back to the stagecraft at the front. They had no idea they were in the presence of the man being eulogized. They were simply mourners at a funeral, unaware that they were about to become witnesses to a hostile takeover. The creditor was not at the gates. He was already inside. Edward approached the pulpit with a slow, heavy gait, every step a performance of grief. He unfolded a piece of paper, his hand trembling just enough to be noticed. He looked out over the assembled crowd, his gaze lingering on the front row where his niece and nephew sat, heads bowed. He cleared his throat, a pathetic, catching sound that echoed in the cathedral's vaulted ceiling. My brother, Arthur, he began, his voice thick with emotion, was more than a builder of skyscrapers. He was a builder of lives. He built a family. He built a legacy. And now he is gone. From the back pew, Arthur watched the man who had signed his medical death warrant weep crocodile tears. He felt a profound sense of detachment, as if observing a poorly acted scene from a great distance. Edward's voice droned on, weaving a tapestry of lies about brotherhood, loyalty, and loss. He spoke of Arthur's final, quiet days and the family's solemn duty to carry on his work. And though our hearts are broken, Edward said, his voice rising to a crescendo of false sincerity, we take solace in knowing his life's work is in the hands of those who loved him most. We will honor him. We will build upon the foundation he. A crisp, clear voice cut through the sanctimonious air. Mr. Edward Vance. All heads turned. Samuel Chen had risen from the back pew and was walking down the central aisle with a steady, unhurried pace. He held a leather folio in his hand. His expression was not angry, not sad, but one of absolute, unyielding legal authority. Edward stared, his eulogy forgotten. Mr. Chen. This is hardly the time or place. On the contrary, Samuel said, his voice ringing with clarity in the sudden, complete silence. This is precisely the time and place. He stopped at the foot of the altar, a few feet from the front pew. He did not look at the casket. He looked directly at Edward, then at Liam, then at Chloe. I am here today on behalf of my client, Samuel announced, the primary secured creditor to Vance Construction, its subsidiaries, and the personal estates of Liam Vance, Chloe Vance, and Edward Vance. A ripple of confusion and shock passed through the congregation. Liam half rose from his seat. What in God's name are you talking about? Our credit is impeccable. Your credit, Samuel corrected, was impeccable. Your debt, however, is now consolidated. Every loan, every bond, every line of credit you have leveraged over the past 6 months has been legally acquired by my client. He opened the folio. As of 9:00 a.m. this morning, Vance Construction defaulted on covenant clauses tied to a master loan agreement. Specifically, the fraudulent misrepresentation of company assets and the issuance of a legally falsified death certificate for its majority shareholder for the purpose of financial gain. The air was sucked out of the room. Edward's face went from pale to ashen. The performance was over. This was real. I don't know who your client is, Liam snarled, taking a step forward, but this is harassment. This is insane. My client is Trident Equity Partners, Samuel said calmly, which, as the sole owner of your debt, is now exercising its contractual right to immediate and total asset seizure. He pulled a thick sheaf of documents from the folio. This is a court-ordered writ of execution. It gives my client's representatives full, immediate control over all corporate headquarters, active work sites, financial accounts, and personal properties listed as collateral. Which is to say everything. He placed the documents on the edge of the front pew with a soft, final thud. Panic, pure and unadulterated, erupted in the faces of the three Vances. Chloe let out a small, strangled gasp. Liam's face was a mask of disbelief and rage. Edward, the architect of the entire scheme, simply stared at the documents as if they were a serpent. He understood immediately. They had been played. Every dollar they had borrowed, every asset they had leveraged, had been a step into a trap. You can't do this, Chloe whispered, her voice stripped of all its theatricality. That is our inheritance. Samuel Chen looked at her, and for the first time, a flicker of something like pity crossed his face. You have no inheritance, he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent cathedral. You have only debt. And the bill has just come due. The empire they had stolen, the fortune they had killed for, had evaporated in the space of 90 seconds. It had been swallowed whole, not by a will, but by a writ. As the reality of Samuel Chen's words settled, a frantic, panicked energy filled the front of the cathedral. Liam grabbed the writ, his face contorted in a snarl of disbelief as he scanned the legal jargon. Chloe began to sob, not with grief, but with the raw, ugly terror of a spoiled child having her favorite toy ripped from her hands. Edward, the pragmatist, was already turning to Samuel, his mind racing for a loophole, a legal angle, a way to negotiate his way out of the abyss that had just opened beneath them. "Who is your client?" Edward demanded, his voice a strained whisper. "This is a hostile, predatory action. We can fight this in court. We can declare bankruptcy, we can." A slow, deliberate tapping sound echoed from the back of the church. Tap. 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 Every head turned. The sound was the rhythmic beat of a cane on the stone floor. From the shadows of the rearmost pew, the man known as Alastair Graves rose to his feet. He moved into the central aisle, his posture erect, his gaze fixed on the tableau of chaos at the altar. The whispers that had started rippling through the crowd died instantly, replaced by a stunned, breath-held silence. There was something familiar in the man's gait, in the set of his jaw, in the cold, unwavering intensity of his stare. He walked with that same measured pace Samuel had used, each tap of the cane a punctuation mark in the unfolding drama. He did not stop at the front pew. He continued past the casket, past his weeping daughter and his raging son, and came to a stop directly in front of his brother at the pulpit. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Edward's eyes widened, a dawning horror chasing away the frantic calculations. The face was older, thinner, the hair white, but the eyes were unmistakable. They were the eyes of the brother he had condemned to a living death. Slowly, deliberately, the man raised a hand and removed his glasses. He let them hang from his fingers, breaking the last piece of his disguise. The murmurs in the crowd swelled into a collective gasp as recognition struck them like a physical blow. He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over his children. He saw not the son and daughter he had raised, but strangers, their faces pale and slack-jawed with shock. He looked at Liam's impotent fury and Chloe's terrified tears, and felt only a vast, empty distance. Then he looked back at Edward. He did not shout. He did not rage. His voice, when it came, was quiet, imbued with a weariness that was heavier than stone but laced with the sharp, cutting edge of forged steel. It was the voice of a man pushed past grief, past anger, into a realm of pure, cold consequence. "My name," he said, the words dropping into the cathedral's silence like stones into a deep well, "is Arthur Vance." The name itself was a judgment. It was a refutation of the lie in the casket, a demolition of the eulogy, a negation of every action they had taken. Chloe let out a shriek that was half sob, half scream, and stumbled backward as if she had seen a specter. Liam simply froze, the legal documents slipping from his nerveless fingers and fluttering to the floor. But it was Edward who broke completely. The meticulous planner, the man of cool control, visibly shattered. The blood drained from his face, his mouth opened and closed without a sound, and his legs gave way. He crumpled to the floor of the chancel, his composure, his lies, and his entire world disintegrating in the face of the living man he had buried. The sight of his brother, alive and in absolute control, was a verdict more final than any court could deliver. Arthur did not acknowledge his brother's collapse on the floor, nor did he look again at his stunned children. The personal confrontation was over, the rest was a matter of logistics. The charged, emotional atmosphere of the cathedral was about to become a sterile, legal proceeding. At a subtle nod from Samuel Chen, two men and a woman in plain, dark business suits, who had been sitting quietly in the third pew, stood and walked to the front. They moved with an unobtrusive professionalism that spoke of law enforcement. The lead detective, a calm, gray-haired man, approached Arthur. "Mr. Vance." The detective said, his voice low and respectful. "I'm Detective Miller. We spoke with Mr. Chen." "Is this everyone?" "This is everyone," Arthur confirmed, his voice devoid of any inflection. He then turned his attention back to his family, who were now being helped to their feet by the other two officers. The initial shock had given way to a dawning, panicked comprehension. "Father, you don't understand," Liam began, his voice a desperate plea. "We were trying to protect the company. We thought we did what we had to do." "You did what you wanted to do," Arthur stated, the words flat and final. He gestured to Samuel, who stepped forward and handed Detective Miller a slim, waterproof briefcase. "In here," Samuel explained to the detective, "you will find everything. Recorded conversations from the hospital, courtesy of a nurse who will be granted full immunity for her testimony. You'll find a complete forensic accounting of the Vance construction books for the past 6 months, tracing every fraudulent transaction, every illegal bonus, every personal expense disguised as a corporate cost. And you will find a sworn affidavit from the county clerk detailing the bribe he accepted from Edward Vance in exchange for producing a falsified death certificate. Every word was a nail being hammered into a coffin, not the empty one at the front of the church, but the legal one that would entomb his family. The evidence was not just damning, it was absolute, a meticulously constructed case file that left no room for doubt or legal maneuvering. This is a mistake, Chloe sobbed as a female officer gently but firmly took her on. It's a family matter. You can't do this. It stopped being a family matter when you committed conspiracy to commit fraud, Arthur said, looking at her directly for the first and last time. He saw no glimmer of the little girl he had raised, only a stranger consumed by avarice. It stopped being a family matter when you decided my life was worth less than a new portfolio of stock. Detective Miller nodded to his officers. The click of handcuffs was shockingly loud in the cathedral's nave. One pair for Liam, whose face was now a mask of cold, seething hatred. One for Chloe, who dissolved into hysterical, wailing sobs. And one for Edward, who, having been pulled to his feet, simply stood with his head bowed, a broken man who offered no resistance. The architect of the grand betrayal had no more moves left to make. As they were escorted down the main aisle, a path cleared through the stunned and silent congregation. The city's elite, who had come to mourn a dead man, were now witnesses to something far more shocking: the public dismantling of a dynasty. Their feigned sympathy curdled into morbid fascination. The spectacle of the Vance heirs being led away in handcuffs, their carefully curated public mourning transformed in an instant into a walk of profound and private shame, was a far better story than any eulogy. The funeral was over. The procession had begun. The dust motes danced in a pale afternoon light that streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of what was once his office. Arthur Vance stood in the center of the vast, empty room, the tap of his cane the only sound in the corporate mausoleum. The grand mahogany desk was gone, sold off in Liam's fire sale. The plush leather chairs, the shelves of architectural awards, the photos of skylines he had personally shaped, all vanished. On the wall behind where his desk once sat, a faint, clean rectangle marked the spot where a framed picture of his smiling children had hung for 2 decades. The ghost of a memory. He had won. By every metric, it was a total victory. He had reclaimed his company, his fortune, his name. The complex legal machinery put in motion by Samuel Chen had worked flawlessly. The assets were frozen, then transferred to the control of Alastair Graves, and then finally back to the resurrected Arthur Vance. The shell companies he had created, Trident, Apex, had served their purpose and were now being dissolved. The legal fate of his family was a distant, clinical report he read in Samuel's office. Faced with irrefutable evidence, they had all taken plea deals. Edward, as the mastermind, received the longest sentence for a litany of charges including conspiracy and felony fraud. Liam and Chloe, for their roles, received lesser but still substantial prison terms. There would be no dramatic trial, no further public spectacle. Their chapter was closed, relegated to the dry language of court filings. Arthur felt no satisfaction reading the verdict, no surge of vindication. He felt only the quiet, heavy finality of an amputation. A necessary procedure, but a profound loss nonetheless. He ran a hand along the cool glass of the window, looking down at the city he had helped build. He owned it all again. And it felt like ashes in his hand. The company was tainted, the name poisoned not by scandal but by a deep, personal rot. To rebuild Van's construction now would be to live in a house where his family had died, spiritually if not literally. A few days later, in a sterile boardroom, he met with the few remaining senior executives he still trusted. He was brief and direct. Van's construction is being dissolved, he announced. The news was met with stunned silence. All outstanding debts will be paid. All employee contracts will be honored with generous severance packages. All physical assets will be liquidated. But, Arthur, his old head of engineering said, his face etched with confusion, this is your life's work. You can't just end it. Some foundations are too compromised to build on again, Arthur said, his voice calm and resolute. You have to clear the ground and start over. And that is what he did. The liquidation was swift and efficient, managed by Samuel Chen's firm. The empire that had taken a lifetime to build was dismantled in a matter of months. But the capital, the vast fortune that remained after all obligations were met, was not hoarded. It was repurposed. In a quiet ceremony with only Samuel and a few legal witnesses present, Arthur signed the documents that created the Northwood Foundation. The name was a private tribute, a nod to the clinic where he had been reborn and to the coded message that had brought Samuel to his side. The Foundation's charter was simple. Its first act was to establish a perpetual scholarship and grant program for nursing students and healthcare aides, named in honor of Maria, who had respectfully declined any personal reward but accepted the honor for her profession. The Foundation's primary mission, however, was to build. Not for profit, but for purpose. Arthur, working from a small, practical office, not a penthouse suite, spent his days poring over blueprints again. But these were not plans for glittering skyscrapers or luxury condos. They were schematics for affordable housing developments, for community medical clinics in underserved neighborhoods, for public libraries and vocational training centers. His victory was not in the reclamation of his old kingdom, but in its deliberate, voluntary abdication. He had taken back his legacy only to give it away, transforming a monument to personal wealth into an engine for public good. The work was hard, the hours long, but it was clean. It was a foundation built not on the ruined ground of his family's betrayal, but on a new plot, cleared of ghosts. Sometimes, late at night, sitting alone with his architectural drawings, the silence would press in, and he would feel the stark loneliness of his new life. He had lost a brother and 2 children. That was a truth no new beginning could erase. His actions had been a defense, a necessary response to protect what was his and to see that justice was served. But the cost was real, a permanent ache in the architecture of his own heart. He was a builder who had been forced to demolish his own house. And now, in the evening of his life, he was simply grateful for the chance to build again, one solid, honest brick at a time. We began this story with a man sitting in the back of his own funeral, calculating the cost of his family's greed. In the end, we learned that the true price wasn't measured in dollars seized or assets reclaimed, but in the profound, lonely silence of a victory that required the loss of his entire family. His ultimate triumph wasn't in punishing them, but in choosing to build a new foundation of purpose on the very ground they had ruined. That was a difficult but powerful journey, and we're so glad you joined us for it here on Content Channel. The nurse, Maria, made a choice that changed everything by taking an immense personal and professional risk to save Arthur. What do you believe was the single most important reason she decided to intervene? Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. But while Arthur builds his new legacy, his lawyer Samuel Chen discovers that the financial rot Edward left behind goes deeper than anyone imagined, threatening to poison the new foundation from its very roots.